Doctors can't make me healthy, they just make me less sick. Health is something that I or we as patients do for ourselves based on lifestyle foundationally. And these are choices that we make every single day. And no doctor can really determine my lifestyle. It's something I have to do.
Welcome to the Hunger for Change podcast. I'm Niklas Gustafson, and over the last decade, I've been my own guinea pig, reviving ancestral living and holistic health and nutrition. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Robert Lufkin, a physician, medical school professor, and New York Times best-selling author with over 200 peer-reviewed papers, and a freshly launched book called Lies I Taught in Medical School, who now says the real root cause of disease isn't what you think, and your doctor probably won't bring it up. Robert Lufkin, thank you so much. I'm honored, and this is a privilege to have you on my podcast.
Oh, thanks, Nicholas. I'm a fan of your work too, and so this is going to be a fun conversation. I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm so much looking forward. As I told you before, I've been following you for at least 10 or 12 years. So I'm really excited. First of all, what does health mean to you?
Wow, it's a great question. My background is in medicine, and I've essentially spent my whole career as a medical school professor, practicing medicine, doing research, and teaching. And in that, I always thought of as health as what we did with our patients in medical school, and I've come to a realization that even though I'm a doctor. Doctors can't make me healthy, they just make me less sick. And health is something that I or we as patients do for ourselves based on things like lifestyle foundationally. And these are choices that we make every single day. And no doctor can really determine my lifestyle. It's something I have to do. They could certainly give us suggestions and advice, but lifestyle is a really empowering idea. It's something that I get to choose every single morning when I wake up. When I wake up, what I eat, when I exercise, all those things. And that to me, that is the secret to health.
Great. So the book that you have behind you, Lies I Taught in Medical School. I'd like to know more about this. What do you think is the biggest lie currently taught in medical schools?
Wow, there's so many,
There are many, right?
Yeah, and I think one of them is I just mentioned about doctors and health versus sickness. Another one that kind of was a wake-up call in writing this book was the chronic diseases that most adults have, at least one of these diseases, and many, as they get older, have more and more of these diseases. And these diseases are a special class of diseases that, although they were present in the last century, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, they've reached epidemic proportions never before seen. And it's a group of diseases that many people think of being as separate, things like obesity, diabetes, hypertension or high blood pressure, heart attack, stroke, cancer, Alzheimer's disease, and even mental illness. These diseases actually now affect most adults. Will eventually go on to get one or more of these. And in fact, the cause of death statistically for you and I and most of our listeners will be one of these relatively short-listed diseases. And the interesting thing is I used to think of these diseases as you either had them or you didn't have them. And the doctor would diagnose them and say, oh, you have diabetes, or you have Alzheimer's disease, or you have, take your pick from the list. And what I realize, and what many of my colleagues still don't appreciate, I think, is that these diseases don't start when the doctor diagnoses them. Instead, we now know that they begin weeks to years to literally decades before the doctor makes a diagnosis.
Yeah.
what does that mean? Well, if I wait until, I can't find my keys anymore, and the doctor says, well, you have Alzheimer's disease, or, I have chest pain, and oh, you have a heart attack. I've missed a tremendous opportunity, literally decades in most cases, when I could begin prevention and doing things to to help slow down or even reverse these diseases. And many people aren't aware that this is possible. I certainly was at the,
Yeah, I mean, I heard that Alzheimer's disease is you actually start getting the disease like 30, 40 years before you get the symptoms. Is that true? That long?
yeah, yeah. I mean, all these diseases really, they begin on a metabolic level, or they have a strong basis in metabolic dysfunction. All of them. There are other factors at play, but metabolic dysfunction is an underlying root cause for all of them. And many people aren't aware that this metabolic dysfunction begins long before
Yeah.
the doctor diagnoses them, and that's a key opportunity for treatment. I mean, so I have friends and colleagues who say, hey, I'm healthy. I don't have one of those diseases yet. I haven't got the diagnosis. So I'm not going to worry about my lifestyle now because it doesn't matter because I don't have the disease, right? Well, actually, we all have these diseases that are in our future, right?
Yeah.
As Jim Morrison says, nobody gets out alive, right? We're all going to die of one of these chronic diseases, and statistically, it's going to be one
Right.
of the ones on that list.
Yeah.
And the question is, do you want to start having your chronic disease, take your pick, when you're 50 years old, or do you want it at 70, or
Yeah.
do you want it at 110?
Right.
With lifestyle changes, and there are things that we can do. We can push these back. And the amazing thing is, it's the same lifestyle techniques that will improve my chances with diabetes and reverse diabetes, literally type 2 diabetes, and Alzheimer's disease, and mental illness, and cancer, and heart attack. It's wild. So it's the same kind of healthy way of living that affects all these diseases.
Yeah. Yeah. So when you say that the lies, I mean, when you talk about lies taught in medical school, are they just outdated or are they even deliberately misleading?
Yeah, that's a great question, because lies is a loaded term, right? It implies intention, and I think, in my heart, I don't believe that most human beings get up in the morning and want to harm another human being. I think, we basically want to be good in the world and
Yep.
treat our fellow people well, but there are multiple pernicious conscious and subconscious influences that drive us to make, through institutionalized decisions and financial incentives and other things, that ultimately are not in the best interests of the patients, and I would submit can actually harm them. The whole idea of lies I taught in medical school. It's kind of a riff on a quote that I love from one of the greatest physicians who ever lived. It was Sir William Osler. Over 120 years ago, he made one of the greatest quotes about medical education when he addressed a graduating class of medical students on their last day of medical school. They were about to become doctors. And in his address, he started off, he said, gentlemen, and at the time, most were male, but he said, gentlemen, we have a confession to make. 50% of the things that we've just taught you in medical school are wrong. And furthermore, we don't know which half it is. And that, anyone who knows anything about medical education or science in general knows that it's constantly an evolving process, that whatever we think is the truth now is probably going to change years from now. And we need to keep being open-minded to new things and evolve our thinking. Unlike religion, where belief is important. The interesting thing about science, I can't remember who said this, but the great thing about science is it doesn't matter whether you believe in it for it to be true.
Mm,
These are universal concepts that apply
totally.
all over the world to all people and everything, whether you believe it or not. But that scientific foundation is constantly changing, constantly evolving. And that's the challenge that doctors have with keeping up with medical education. It's very hard. And a lot of the lies that are being taught are just outdated concepts that new research has shown to be incorrect, but it hasn't really hit the mainstream yet with medical
No,
education.
that's true. So, out of all these lies, which one do you think caused the most harm to public health, and why is it still being taught?
Okay, there's probably two, but I'll start with one. Today in the United States, most people are overweight or obese. It's over 50%. The current recommendation for how to lose weight is to exercise more and eat less, which makes sense on the face of it, but it doesn't actually work, as we've seen, because what happens? Exercise is very healthy. It's good for so many health benefits. Unfortunately, weight loss is not one of them.
Mm.
For the simple reason is it's very hard to exercise enough to burn off 500 calories from that muffin that you had at the local store. And secondly, when we exercise, we increase our appetite, so that causes us to want to eat more. Finally, the lie, just eat less, implies that all calories are equal, that a calorie is just a calorie. And they are in a physics sense with, units of heat, but our bodies don't work that way. And as you know, and your audience knows, there of the three food groups, the essential ones, fat and protein, which will die if we don't eat. The non-essential ones, which we don't have to eat at all, are carbohydrates. And carbohydrates specifically drive a fat storage hormone called insulin, whereas the others do to a much less extent. That's why 100 calories of, let's say, carbohydrates in the form of potato chips has a very different effect than 100 calories in the form of a hard-boiled egg.
Yeah.
So, so that's one of the big lies, just that's affecting everyone, and the numbers are continuing to
Right.
increase.
Yeah. So, do you think that health even is possible in a system designed to profit from our illness?
Well, that's
Because in
again
the
a great.
Western world today, that's the truth. Like it's we profit from illness.
That's a great question. I mean, my mom was a dietitian. The dietitians are the ones who are the nutrition experts. But I will always notice that when she went to her dietitian conferences, they were sponsored by Coca-Cola and McDonald's and junk food
Mm.
makers. And literally, the education of dietitians is paid for and directed by junk food makers. Well, with doctors, it's even worse because medical education is largely underwritten through the pharmaceutical industry, which has a vested interest in prescribing drugs for doctors. And this is a corrupting influence. And as an example, the sort of gateway disease for all the other diseases is insulin resistance, or in advanced form is called type 2 diabetes. It's when our body fails to be able to process glucose and the insulin rates rise. Well, there's a trusted medical institution it used to be called the American Diabetes Association, or yeah, it still is the American Diabetes Association. And even though it's an American company, its influence is felt around the world. Well, for type 2 diabetes, their recommendation is to give certain pills and then injections. like metformin and insulin, other things, which actually are life-saving, because elevated levels of glucose can literally kill you. You'll die.
Yes.
So these are life-saving drugs. But the problem is they recommend these drugs as a way to manage type 2 diabetes. And although they will save their life, the interesting thing, when people are on these drugs, the disease continues to progress.
Yeah.
It goes on to
Doesn't really
complications.
solve the root cause, right?
That's right. And the complications for diabetes are what? Amputation. The number one cause of surgical amputations is type 2 diabetes. The number one cause of renal failure, kidney failure, dialysis, type 2 diabetes. Number one cause of retinal blindness, on and on and on.
Yep.
Alzheimer's disease is called type 3 diabetes. So they recommend, if you go to the American Diabetic Association website, there are recipes listed where they have relatively high sugar content in the recipes. And their recommendation is, oh, it doesn't matter. You can have your sugar, but just, quote, cover it with insulin, which gives an extra dose of insulin. Well, this advice is, in my opinion, incorrect, or it doesn't get to the root cause. But if you look at it, insulin makers largely fund the American Diabetes Association. The recipe for the sugar and covering it with insulin, that recipe ad was sponsored by DaVita Corporation, which is one of the world's largest renal dialysis makers.
Wow.
Which is, what is in your future if you continue doing that. So
that's
what's the
really sad.
alternative? Yeah. Well, what's the alternative? Anyway, is that if carbohydrates drive insulin and drive this problem, there are now controlled studies. I'm not making this up. Other people have shown it prospectively, Verda Health and others, in controlled studies, that many, if not most, patients with type 2 diabetes can decrease their drugs or even reverse them completely by removing carbohydrates from their diet. If carbohydrates is the offending substance and it's not necessary for life, just cut it out of the diet, have a low carb diet, and the diabetes will reverse. But what happens? The interesting thing is, unlike treating it with the meds, the injections, the pills, which doesn't, in most cases, reverse the long-term chronic effects, when we reverse type 2 diabetes with lifestyle, which is literally this diet and other things, it actually stops and it doesn't progress. It doesn't go on to those things. But this message isn't being articulated well enough.
No.
And it's because of these pernicious influences, financial and otherwise, that drive even trusted medical institutions like these.
Yeah. So, Robin, if you could go back and redesign medical school, and what would it focus on?
Well, there's when I went to medical school, or there was, and still today, there's very little emphasis on lifestyle. It's doctors about finding a disease and then treating and managing the disease. It's not necessarily about being healthy and preventing the disease. So we want to shift the emphasis to prevention, and that's going to involve an understanding of lifestyle and the significant impact that lifestyle has. And that's, it's basically 4 things: nutrition, sleep, exercise, and stress.
Yeah.
Those 4 things need to be emphasized in medical school. And then the whole medical system needs to be redesigned so that an emphasis is put on prevention. Or alternatively, medical care is when people get diseases, but there's a whole, and this is happening in the US and around the world now, there's a whole wellness industry of people who, they don't want to wait till they have a disease and go to their doctor. They want to stay healthy and they want to live a long time. So it's sort of a longevity space too.
Yeah. So does that mean that you think that most chronic conditions today are actually preventable?
They are, we can delay their onset. Those diseases people eventually get. But if I'm going to get one of those chronic diseases, I'd rather get it when I'm 110 than when I'm 55.
Yeah.
And that there is evidence to show that we can delay the onset of diseases. And no one, lives their life without any disease. You die
Yeah.
of something,
Yeah.
but pushing it back as far as
That's what we
possible
want.
is great. It's health span.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you think that we're mistaking common for normal when it comes to chronic illness?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's some recent studies that show up to 88 or 90% of people in the United States are metabolically unhealthy, and they don't know it. Metabolically unhealthy is defined by abnormal triglycerides, HDL, abdominal girth, glucose, and blood
Yeah.
pressure. Well, those basic factors. And then we just mentioned most people in the United States are obese or overweight. Most people in the United States have hypertension or they're being treated for it, most adults, and on and on and on. So if we pick average, we don't want to pick the average blood pressure if everybody's hypertensive. We want to be optimal. So
Yeah.
when we get a lab test, we don't want to look for normal values. We want to look for optimal values,
Right.
for sure.
So
Great
why
point.
are more and more people saying I had to heal myself because my doctor didn't? Because that's something
Yeah,
that we hear, and a lot of people kind of look for information somewhere else because they actually see that they're not being healed by the doctor.
yeah, it reflects a general change in thinking about root causes versus symptoms. Sort of if the symptom is, my floor is wet, the first thing I'm going to do is mop the floor, and I can just mop the floor every time that happens. But unless I realize there's a leak in the roof, I'm going to keep mopping the floor. So if somebody has a headache, you can give them, aspirin or painkiller for the headache, but the headache has many, many root causes. It could be
Yep.
just due to stress, or it could be due to a brain tumor or an infection. And unless we address the root cause, then that's a problem. And today, modern medicine is oftentimes overlooking the root cause, certainly with these chronic diseases that we just mentioned.
Right. So, do you think that chronic disease has become the business model of a broken system?
Yeah, I think that's a fair, it's
It's very
sad but
sad.
true. I mean,
Yeah.
well, it's, let's not assigning blame, but just as looking at the motivations. You know, most human beings, myself included, are basically lazy. If I go into a doctor's office and I have a disease, and that doctor has 15 minutes to spend with me, I would much rather get a pill or even surgery that will take care of that disease rather than the doctor explaining to me that I need to change my entire life, the way
Yeah.
I eat, the way I sleep, the way I
True.
exercise. It just, anyone would rather have a pill or surgery, and patients demand it. The problem is, for these chronic diseases that I mentioned, most of the pills and surgeries that are given, and they work, but they work largely on the symptoms, and in many cases, they don't address the root cause. So I'll get the pill, the symptoms will go away, but the disease will continue to progress, and that's the problem.
Okay. So if you, let's say you have 50 minutes with a new patient, what would you tell him? I mean, a patient that is suffering from any of these diseases that we've talked about, overweight, diabetes, Alzheimer. If you have like a very limited amount of time, what would you tell him?
Well, the first thing is to treat the acute effects. Anything that, and I'm not recommending anyone stop their medicines or change anything that their doctor has recommended. And doctors are very good at the Western allopathic medical system is very good for acute things. Even today, if I get hit by a car outside, I'm going to want a blood transfusion. I'm going to want my spleen out. I'm
Yeah.
going to want my bones set. But with chronic diseases, they don't do so well. So first of all, you treat the symptoms, but then but then address the lifestyle. And I would submit that doctors may not be the best place for people to learn about lifestyle. I mean, if you've only got 15 minutes with somebody, it's hard to change your whole lifestyle. In fact, coaching or other, there may be other methods. And now with AI, there's a lot of different
Right.
possibilities. But even though I'm a doctor, I'm not sure doctors are in the best position to help people with the lifestyle changes. We can certainly validate them and say, yeah, this is good, you should do it. But I don't see doctors spending 3 hours with somebody going over, a meal plan and, how strength training is better than cardio, these kinds of things.
Right. Yeah.
I'm not sure that our modern healthcare system isn't set up for
Mm.
it. The insurance incentives aren't there. I think we almost have to redesign a wellness system for this.
Right. So, okay, so you mentioned AI. Do you think that AI is a threat, or is it a revolution to these kind of to heal chronic disease, and or to even change your lifestyle?
Yeah, I mean, great question. It's artificial intelligence. I mean, it's a broad term. It's sort of like sports, it can mean all kinds of different things. So narrowing down, certainly what we're talking about is the revolution that started about 10 years ago with deep learning, first with convolutional neural networks, now with large language models, generative AI, and it's just changed the game in unexpected ways. And I think it's going to revolutionize healthcare. I mean, already when I talk to ChatGPT or Grok or one of these other apps, I realize that I'm having access to an entity, maybe not a consciousness, but an entity that really could draw on the world's knowledge.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
still
it's
at a
amazing.
rudimentary level,
Yeah.
but it's
Yeah.
frightening the just the scope of that. And in healthcare, if you think about it as a doctor, if you're a very sick patient, you come in with, what used to be a stack of charts like this, but now it's just a big medical record. The doctor doesn't have time to look at all those things. They will look at the last 10 pages, skim it over, and that's the analysis. Then they'll ask you a few questions. But what if the AI could read your entire medical record? Not just your medical record, but your whole life experience. So that when, maybe there are some symptoms that you can't explain, and they can go, oh, the AI will go, wait a minute, don't you remember back when you were 4 years old, you fell down and you da 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 da. And so getting access to information like that. The other thing I think is integrating it. I work with a company out of the UK that they have an app, and it links up to a ring, which is similar to an Aura ring,
Yeah.
but it's their proprietary ring.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it hooks up to a CGM that I wear. It takes my genetic data that they test. It takes my blood
Brilliant.
tests.
Mm.
Then it takes my food. And I go on the app, and there's a large language model there. So there's basically an AI that knows my data.
Wow.
It knows my genetics, knows my labs.
Yeah.
It knows my ring data. So I can go, hey, you know what? I'm not feeling very well this morning. What's going on? They go, well, your glucose just shot up to 195, and you had 3 candy bars. And oh, by the way, you only slept for 3 hours last night, during which time you only had 4 minutes of REM sleep. So this kind of feedback is something that we're not going to get from our doctors necessarily, but it can be intensively personalized through AI with insights of myself that I don't even know. And now there are companies that are actually, they have access to not just your Aura ring, but all your social media, all your location data from your cell phone, everything you've done. So it can analyze your emails with all your friends and do sentient analysis, like, oh, these 5 friends you usually communicate with and joke around. These 5 friends you talk politics with. These 5 friends you're serious. And they'll go, oh, you're not communicating with them anymore. Are you getting depressed? You used to go to the gym every day in your car. Now you're going to the liquor store and the strip club. What's up with that?
That sounds really
So
scary.
it can, yeah. I mean, but it's insights that are really important for our lives,
course.
that make a difference. So
Yeah.
I think AI is going to be transformative in ways that we can't even imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, something that simple as a blood work. I put the blood work in ChatGPT to have it analyzed, and that's amazing. And if there are things that I have no idea about, I just ask more, and I get more information. So it completely changed my way of viewing the results of the blood works. I think that's amazing. So now that we've been talking about resources out there for lifestyle changes, um, could we take a look at science? I mean, for example, how do we know if the science we're following is true when it comes to health and lifestyle changes?
Yeah, I mean, validation is really key, and I like you're implying. I try to rely on the scientific method, and there's sort of a hierarchy of knowledge validation, and with the bottom is expert opinion. Whether it's me, Dr. Lufkin says so, or my mom says so, my grandmother says so. That's very weak evidence just because somebody says it, an expert says it or claims it. The next level then is you can move on up through it. You can have epidemiological studies that show correlation. Then finally, more like a gold standard, a controlled prospective, randomized, blind clinical trial. And the problem is those clinical trials are very expensive, and they can be run on very narrow questions. And some questions we can't even ask them, like longevity questions in human beings, just because it's not feasible. So it's always challenging making decisions ourselves, what we're going to do in our own life, what is reasonably expected to make a difference in my life versus what is, snake oil or not useful information.
So how much influence do pharmaceutical companies really have on what our doctors believe?
Huge, huge. I mean, at my medical school, I used to run a laboratory that did research. We published over 200 papers and 12 textbooks in various fields. We had grants from the federal government, millions of dollars. We had device makers, but we also had pharmaceutical companies. And one of the interesting things that some of the pharmaceutical companies would do is they would give you a project to do research on, like take this drug, run this study with these patients. But they would put a clause in there, we have the right to approve or disapprove publication. In other words, if they don't like what you're going to write, they won't give you any more grants, which is threatening enough. But even more than that, they will prevent you from publishing the results of that paper. Today, it's been looked at in a systematic manner, and that is that generally papers that are published sponsored by drug companies tend to favor the drug results, and neutral papers tend to be more balanced, as you'd expect. But unfortunately, a lot of research is funded by drug companies.
Right.
So even though you may have a prospective randomized controlled trial, the gold standard, if it's paid for by a drug company, and that's one of only 10 papers they could publish because the other 9 had negative results, then, that what's a poor doctor or even patient to do? Reading, we don't have access to all that information.
So, I mean, that affects the scientific research outcomes. That's obvious.
Yeah, it affects opinions. There's a famous nutritional guidelines from the United States called the food pyramid from the USDA. It's a pyramid.
I think actually that was invented in Sweden, the food pyramid.
Oh, was it?
That's what I read in the 1971, I think. And then,
probably the Swedes invent all sorts of cool stuff. But they were Nina Teicholz is a journalist and now a PhD investigator who published recently on the food pyramid. And the food pyramid, if you look at the bottom, it's cereals and grains, and then plants, and then meat at the top. And this, even though it was a U.S. recommendation, it was followed kind of around the world. And certainly in the U.S., it drives school lunch programs and prisoners and military, and everybody follows it. They think it's good advice. Well, she recently showed that the most recent edition of the food pyramid, the USDA committee that wrote it, 90% of the authors had conflicts with the junk food business.
Yeah.
Basically, they were paid by junk food makers. But if you look at the food pyramid, that should be obvious because the bottom row, what we're supposed to eat most of, is junk cereals and
Yeah.
grains and all sorts of
Yeah.
stuff like that.
That's crazy. So what do you think studies that challenge mainstream health advice are often ignored or suppressed?
Yeah, I mean, if I was really cynical, I would. Max Planck, the physicist, famously said that science advances one funeral at a time. In other words, ideas don't change until
Mm.
the old professors die off and stuff. But I'd like to think it's changing faster than that. And today,
Mm.
truly, the rate of knowledge is accelerating rapidly. I mean,
Okay.
I've been doing this a long time,
Yeah.
and I've never seen anything like it. How
Okay.
fast
Okay.
knowledge
Interesting.
comes. Yeah. And so it it's still difficult to challenge the paradigm, but I'm hopeful that people are more and more open-minded to it.
Okay. Okay. Great. So I mean, the term misinformation is that kind of a modern weapon against like protecting corporate interests?
Yeah, I mean, they're corporations want to spin the facts to, like the tobacco companies famously said that tobacco doesn't cause cancer. Smoking tobacco, it's healthy. It's not.
Yeah.
It doesn't cause cancer.
Yeah.
Well, eventually, that was disproven, or certainly the evidence was strong for the other way, and basically the tobacco business sort of collapsed in the 1980s. Well, an interesting thing happened in the United States. The big tobacco companies who saw their future wasn't so great in tobacco sales, they pivoted into a new industry, which was the junk food business. And they purchased large junk food companies and allowed them to take their marketing genius, because they are, truly the best at marketing. And, they would sell it at gas stations and 7-Elevens. They place their product around. But now they could go all out, and they could even sell to children and market to children, which is something they weren't allowed to do as tobacco companies.
Okay. Okay. So Robert, you've shared that you grew up with a dietitian mom, and that's so cool. And you must what you've learned at medical school. I suppose you kind of connected that knowledge from both worlds. And so let's dig into the um, I mean, nutrition when it comes to, for example, processed seed oils. Um, why do you believe processed seed oils are one of the biggest dietary threats today?
Yeah, it's a great question, because if you go to one of our trusted medical sources, the American Heart Association, on their website, they recommend seed oils as being, quote, heart healthy.
Yeah.
Things like canola oil and other oils. Now, out of defense of them, seed oils, when we consume them, actually lower the LDL cholesterol, and the American Heart Association is fixated on the LDL cholesterol
Yeah.
as a driver of heart disease.
Yeah. Yeah. In
It's
Europe as well, it's the same here.
Yeah, and it's more nuanced than that. That's a whole chapter. But back to seed oils. The American Heart Association, if you dig a little deeper, there's a darker effect there. Seed oils were developed in your audience probably has heard this before, but they were developed at the turn of the 20th century.
Mm.
Some German scientists were going to try and develop lubricant for U-boats, among other things. And there was cottonseed oil from the cotton industry and the cotton gins. They had all these seeds they didn't know what to do with, and whale oil was becoming less common. All sorts of things were happening. So they were trying to make industrial machine oil, and they came up with this creamy white substance that they figured, wow, it kind of looks like butter, but it's not. But anyway, they found out people would eat it. So they rebranded it called Crisco, and they
Right.
began selling it. A company called Procter and Gamble, and they sold it as an alternative to lard, which is an animal fat.
Uh,
And interestingly, in the middle of the 20th century, Procter and Gamble, this company, bankrolled a struggling scientific organization called the American Heart Association. They gave them millions of dollars and basically got them going.
mm,
And so today we see seed oils on their thing, but um, on the other side of the coin, seed oils, in my opinion, the evidence is pretty strong. They're pro-inflammatory, omega-6 linoleic
that-
acid. They drive oxidation, inflammation. They drive insulin resistance, and they maybe one of the, I believe it's one of the big causes that's driving our metabolic disease. It's difficult to put a finger on a single one, but seed oils are there. And the problem with seed oils is they're everywhere. All salad
yeah,
dressings. When I buy
yeah.
my hummus, I want to be healthy, and I look at half of it's canola oil. And then famously in it was around 1980 or not, no, 1990, all fryers, which previously used tallow, beef tallow, healthy beef tallow around the world, basically they all switched to seed oils, which were cheaper. When McDonald's and Burger King in the United States and elsewhere, famously under pressure from sort of a misguided billionaire who again was afraid of LDL cholesterol, convinced them to remove beef tallow and switch to seed oils. And today,
Right.
almost all fryers are seed oils, although there's a move now to go
Yeah,
back to
I've
tallow.
seen that in the US. I don't think we've seen that in Europe yet, but I've seen that in the US. People are actually some companies are going back to tallow and lard, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which is that's really good news because I mean seed oils is a highly processed product. So if we take a look at grains, so if grains are so essential, why do people radically improve when they eliminate them from their diet?
Well, I'm going to push back and say they're essential. I don't believe they're essential at all.
No, no,
Human,
I mean
oh,
essential.
oh,
I mean they're
essential.
not really essential.
Yeah. Well, I mean, before before the agricultural revolution 12,000 years ago, human
Yeah,
beings ate, there weren't domesticated plants, and grains were not a big part of our diet. So human beings got along fine for most of our history without grains.
true.
And I think they're inexpensive in the United States. They're subsidized by the federal government. In other words, it corn oil is cheaper, and the seed oils are cheaper than beef tallow because they're subsidized, and the grains are cheaper. So for junk food makers, they're very inexpensive. But I believe that most adults, or a significant portion of adults, have a low grade immune reaction to not just gluten, but possibly other proteins that are in the grains that they may not have full celiac disease like we talked about before the
Yeah.
break. And so you don't have to have celiac disease to worry about grains. Other people grains can drive low grade inflammation in people without celiac disease, and I think for that reason, we should always look at grains as a possible cause for inflammation and metabolic disease. And I would avoid them in my diet if you can.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, I told you before. I've been gluten intolerant since birth, and but I was actually having oatmeal in the mornings for a long time, like 10 or 15 years. But then I stopped. I was experimenting, and I realized that even if oat doesn't really contain gluten, I felt so much better when I stopped having this oatmeal every morning. And I know also friends and my family they did the same, like exclude it in their diet, and they feel just so much better.
Yeah, absolutely. In the United States, we soak our grains with a weed killer called glyphosate, which is
Yeah.
not used in Europe to any significant
Yeah,
amount, I
it's
don't
used
think.
less in Europe than in the
Yeah.
US. That's true. Yeah. So you mentioned the calorie topic earlier. Like 1 calorie of protein might not be the same as one carbohydrate calorie. So isn't it misleading or even dangerous to treat a calorie from, like, say seed oils, and the same as say grass-fed beef.
Uh, yeah, it's misleading, and it's not a good way to it doesn't make sense metabolically to consider all calories to be equal. Um, yeah, for all the reasons we mentioned,
Because
absolutely.
I we actually know, we're starting to learn that there's a huge difference, right? But still, I hear people saying that, yeah, so much calories, but they don't really contemplate what's in that calorie. What nutrients do I get from grass-fed beef? What nutrients do I get from seed oils, or even like sugary products?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the a lot of the junk foods are nutrient poor.
Poor, yeah,
They're empty calories is another word for it, versus nutrient rich things like meat products, eggs, and some plants also.
right, yeah. So if you had the power, which three foods would you permanently erase from the supermarket shelves, and why?
That's great. Well, I would get rid of everything except the aisles around the edge that have to be refrigerated or everything like that, where
Yeah.
all the fresh
What's
food is.
fresh? Yeah.
Yeah, and the center part is usually where the processed foods are that have a long shelf life and
Yeah.
unfortunately contribute to our short shelf life.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Actually, what's fresh is mostly something that we should eat. So why do you think it's still legal to market ultra processed junk as heart healthy? We
Well,
talked
they're
about it before, earlier. The seed oils, for example, there, even in Europe, their canola oil is actually marketed as heart healthy.
Yeah, I mean, the American Heart Association sells a logo that says heart healthy, and they put it
Yeah.
on sugary breakfast cereals, and they put it on different things. And
Mm.
it's it it's a matter of reasonable people can agree to disagree on things, and there are still many people, including many of my colleagues, who believe that you're more likely to get a heart attack from eating a hamburger or meat than
Yeah.
you are from
With
eating a
saturated
donut,
fat. Mm.
which is actually not correct in my opinion.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of making things illegal is it's that's a steep question to do that, but even just get people's awareness of it so that sort of a social consciousness, in our zeitgeist. If I go to my daughter's elementary school, and someone hands one of the parents hands the child a cigarette and lights it for them, all the other parents will dive on them and pull it away. It's
Yeah.
everybody knows that cigarettes are unhealthy and children
Yeah.
shouldn't be eating them. But if that same parent instead gets a bowl of sugary cereal and puts chocolate milk on it and then hands it to the kid, everyone will smile and say, "What a good parent."
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
So,
So, Robert, could we? I have actually a couple of questions on fasting. I've been doing intermittent fasting for at least, I think, 12 or 14 years, and I love it. Um, what happens to the body when you stop snacking and like compress your eating window?
yeah, it's a
And
great
why is that good
question.
for your health?
Yeah, it's a great question. Before I read this book, fasting wasn't even on my radar. Now, like you, it's something I do every single day as far as narrowing my eating window. Well, first thing, just on a basic level, when we eat food, we take foreign matter into our bodies, right? That's what food is. And anytime foreign matter comes into our bodies, there's a natural defense called inflammation that's turned on. And while acute inflammation for short periods is good, inflammation turned on all the time is bad. It drives chronic diseases and aging. Well, the advice my mom, the dietitian, gave, and others, is that adults should eat all the time.
Yeah.
Even my
Yeah.
kids, they get snacks between their meals at their
Yeah.
school. And if we're eating all the time and there's food in our gut all the time, inflammation's turned on all the time. So very basic effect, by not having foreign matter in your body all the time, you'll be able to turn down the inflammation a little bit there. But it goes much, much more beyond that. There's a
Mm.
basic signaling switch called mTOR, which is a nutrient sensing switch. And when food is present, it's turned on and turns on inflammation and growth and, hyper function. But when it turns off, inflammation drops down. And then if it's off for long enough, something interesting happens. Cell repair comes, where we scavenge, we get rid of damaged materials and rebuild. And both states of mTOR are important, but with modern life, eating all the time and for all sorts of reasons, mTOR is turned on too much. When we fast, we're able to turn it down and get benefits of inflammation and autophagy, among other things.
Hmm. So why do you think um, fasting scares people and even doctors? It scares people not having these 3 meals a day or even 5 or 6 meals a day.
Yeah, it's interesting that it does, because if you think about the world's religions, there's nothing they agree on except except that not eating food for a while, fasting,
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
one of the universal
You're right.
principles, and it has nothing
Mm.
to do with necessarily a spiritual framework, but it's healthy for them, and it could be healthy spiritually. But I think doctors, fasting for long periods of time is associated with starvation and not
Yeah.
eating enough. And my mom always told me, eat, eat. And it was a good feeling when you're eating because you're not starving, right? So anytime you have food, you finish your plate and everything like that. But the idea of this intermittent fasting, where we limit the food window, the intake, I think is very powerful. But doctors aren't tuned into it to the extent they should be. It's
Mm.
arguably one of the most powerful medical treatments. I mean, it's a 2,000-year-old treatment for epilepsy,
Yeah.
is
Right.
fasting. Same thing for, going into ketosis for mental illness. Chris Palmer's showing that. For Alzheimer's disease, it's showing results also. And it just, across the board.
Can fasting? Do you think that fasting can actually reverse disease and increase longevity, or is it just a hype?
Yeah, no, the single most powerful intervention for longevity, is caloric restriction across the board for all animals. And caloric restriction just means eating less and less and less. That's not really doable in humans for a long period of time, but it shows the idea that by decreasing calories, we can imitate and get some of the effects of fasting. So I think fasting is a potential longevity effect, and by improving our metabolism, decreasing our risk for all those chronic diseases, we're going to benefit, and we're going to increase our longevity.
So when it comes to insulin, we mentioned it before, and do you think insulin could be accelerating disease more than we thought before?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of people don't appreciate that. Insulin was life-saving. If I have high blood sugar,
Yeah.
insulin will save my life. But the problem is, insulin also drives other things other than just blood sugar. It drives fat storage, but it drives hyperfunction and growth. So, it turns mTOR on, turns hyperfunction. There's evidence that insulin may promote atherosclerosis. It may promote cancer effects. And
Yeah.
all of these diseases are increased with type 2 diabetes, which, as its effect, has high insulin levels. So to get to your point, I think there's a danger of treating diseases just by increasing the insulin, which is what we do with type 2 diabetes. You would just give them
Yeah.
more insulin. We cover the
Right.
things, because
Yeah.
we may stop them from dying of the hyperglycemia, but the high insulin is what you're saying is having chronic effects on these other diseases and actually driving them. I agree with that. I would agree with that
So if
totally.
this is something that we know, why is it that why don't more doctors actually test for high incident?
That's a great question. Well, when you say we know, that's like you and me.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's a lot of controversy around this. I mean, the
Yeah.
American Diabetic Association would push back on that. You know, their
Mm.
sponsor makes insulin. You know, you don't want to
Yeah.
say, oh,
Yeah.
we don't want to use that.
Mm.
But it's a great question. There's a test that's better than the fasting glucose, and that's the fasting insulin. Yet
Yeah.
very few doctors test for it. And I would argue that fasting insulin is a better predictor of heart attacks
Mm.
and all these chronic diseases than LDL cholesterol. And
Right.
if your doctor
Yep.
doesn't get a fasting insulin, but instead gives you an LDL cholesterol test, it's time for a new doctor.
Right. So if someone wants to lower their insulin today, um, why? What's the first thing you tell them?
Yeah, well, it's lifestyle, and nutrition is the first thing. Carbohydrates raise insulin more than fat and protein, so you want to lower your carbohydrates in diet. But
Yeah.
it's not just eating. You can have a perfect diet, but you can still have high insulin and type 2 diabetes. There's a famous study with sleeping and healthy college students. They took them and deprived them of sleep for a couple days, and they all became pre-diabetic. In other words, their insulin levels rose, and stress from that. Other
Yep.
factors can also drive insulin effects. But I would start with nutrition.
Right. So Robert, I'm really looking forward to reading your book. What are some spoilers you can give us from the book?
Oh wow. Well, there's 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 obviously the book is about how lifestyle is important and how pills and surgeries may work for the acute things, acute symptoms, but many cases don't address the underlying root cause, and we have to do lifestyle and all. It's interesting. There's a drug that I talk about. It's actually the most powerful pharmaceutical for lifespan extension. It's been shown to significantly increase the lifespan in everything from yeast all the way up
Yeah.
to mice, and it's actually available for human beings. It's FDA approved, used for other things, and I actually take it. And I'm not recommending, hey, this is a cheat, so you don't have to do lifestyle. You just take
Yeah.
this pill, but it's a worldwide available drug that many people believe can increase longevity, in addition to the benefits of lifestyle. So
Interesting.
we talk about that a little bit.
Interesting. So I'd love to hear more from you. And could you share what you're working on now? Do you have any interesting big projects that you would like to share?
Wow. I the My background is in radiology, so I look at medical imaging as something for metabolic health, and radiologists really aren't plugged into metabolic health at all. The
Mm.
one scan people get is a CT calcium score, which is
Yeah.
like a 10-minute scan through the chest, and it looks at calcification of the coronary arteries, which is, unlike blood tests or genetics, which tells you your risk of heart disease, this literally shows you your heart disease, and it can help you plan lifestyle interventions. Well, we're developing some new tests, so you basically get this calcium scan,
Mm.
but from the same data. So no additional scans, no more radiation. We can
Mm.
actually determine bone mineral density. So like a
Wow.
DEXA scan. We
Yeah.
can also look at liver fat quantification.
Mhm.
Fatty liver disease is the #1 cause of liver failure and transplantation. And the disease, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, didn't exist before the 1980s when high fructose corn syrup came into the
Yeah.
scene. And
Yeah.
today it's the #1 cause of liver transplant. And it's a strong marker for metabolic disease. So we actually quantify the liver fat with that.
Interesting.
And then we also look at, instead of just giving it a calcium score, which is the amount of calcium in the vessels from 0 to 1,000, a number 10 might be, bad news if you're 30 years old. But if you're 70 years old and you have a score of 10, you pop the champagne. So what we do is we take that score and we normalize it to their age and to their gender. So we come up with like a physiological, biological, arterial age based on their calcium score compared to their chronological age, which of course is their driver's license or passport age.
Yeah. So, Robert, where can people find you? People want to know more about what you do and interesting what we've been talking about today. Where can people find you?
Yeah, you can go to my website, which is robertlufkinmd.com. You can actually download a free chapter of the book if you want, both in audio and PDF form. You can. I'm active on social media. My wife says too active. You can look for me there
Like me.
and say hi. Yeah.
Great. So yeah, I've seen you have a huge X account, right?
Not as big as your Instagram account.
And also you're on Instagram as well. Yeah, great. And I also see actually you share a lot on LinkedIn.
Yeah. I like LinkedIn is a great audience. Each space has interesting, fascinating people. Yeah.
This has been a pleasure. Fascinating talking to you. I hope we can talk in the future as well.
Likewise. Well, hopefully you'll come on my podcast like we talked about before. I'd love to host you. But thanks so much, Niklas.
Thank you so much, Robert. Great talking to you. Bye. Thank you.
Likewise. Bye.
There's so much more to discover. Check out the full podcast series, subscribe for future episodes, and let me know your thoughts in the comments.